The basis for our confusion. Chapter 10. What do they want? Subjects like these that require tens of thousands of hours of research can sometimes be conveyed to others who haven't had the time to do such research in sort of a redundant kind of way. While telling the overall story, hammering maybe 6 core facts like the fact that there is a cabal that controls the world from the shadows, and then pumping another dozen or so broader points like the fact that Operation Mockingbird did indeed exist and probably still does, as one example, is a great way to get through to many who don't have the time or the means to go down the twisting and turning path of a subject such as this, or who aren't familiar with all the subtleties, nuances, and history of it all. So far, we've sought out to find out what information even is, where it comes from, and how it's disseminated to the masses. We've concluded that this info has been controlled and coordinated to fit a particular narrative or agenda going back hundreds, even thousands of years. Yet some believe that this era has ended. And in the time of American world supremacy, that most of the countries of the world have freedom of speech and free-flowing information systems set up, and therefore the information is no longer controlled by a powerful few, as in the days of the kings and queens and corrupt popes. We've determined that these people seem to be suffering from what seems to be a mental illness, or maybe are being unknowingly lured into a cult, where the establishment is the cult and the media heads acting in unison as the cult leader, using cult-like tactics upon whole populations, keeping them scared and insecure and confused, waiting for the nightly news to explain to them what has happened today and what they should think and worry about for tomorrow. We spoke briefly on intelligence operations and experiments being conducted on whole populations like Operation Mockingbird and MK Ultra, with the first one being effectively the weaponization of the news media in order to mass brainwash the whole country, and the latter being a shock and trauma op designed to keep the population in a very confused and submissive state. Upon the realization that this is quite possible to control information and the perception of whole populations, we sought out to identify where this control is coming from. We found that it was primarily through the control of the major media at the time. First through controlling the port towns in the early years, then via control of the print media, then through the control of large expert think tanks who drum up fake research on global issues and then pump their findings through the complicit media bullhorn, of which now consists of the large tech media companies, all owned and in many cases created by these controllers behind the scenes. We found that all of the media and most of these think tank / lobby groups are owned or controlled by a small group of people through control of various business entities like BlackRock and Vanguard as an example. We found many of these think tanks are controlled by the same people through the military-industrial complex, while most of the others are offshoots of the original ones set up 100 years ago by Carnegie, Rockefeller, and their friends. We took a look at many of the global institutions and world bodies like the WHO, the UN, or the IMF and World Bank. We see that these are the fruits of the seeds planted by Carnegie and his European handlers, planted just after the First World War, known as the League of Nations. The whole reason that the First World War even occurred. But that wasn't enough. The world wasn't ready yet, so there was a second one, a more devastating one just horrific enough to get the sheep to finally accept this new world body. And they rebranded it. It was called the United Nations. This was the first step, the most necessary of all steps, a central world body, a central world arbiter. Once you have in place a central world authority, even with limited powers initially, the controllers can slowly take that organization and grow it, adding a tentacle here and a tentacle there, slithering more and more into regular Americans' lives until one day there's a terrible pandemic, one that causes the need for a unified world response. And lo and behold, the controllers just happen to have this world body, one with offshoots now like the WHO, that is in what seems to be a perfect position to jump right in and take over full control of the world during these time periods like during pandemics. But this would also bleed over into any type of major crisis, like problems with police brutality or gun violence, for instance. World bodies everywhere, equipped to come in and help with any crisis in any country at any time. Of course, once the nations cede control, like the WHO wants them to do during the next pandemic, then as we've watched these people do so many times, they will then make the case for the need for more control and will slither further and further into our daily lives. All controlled by people that you've never even heard of, let alone voted for. We found that not only is the media controlled, but so is the culture. We've shown that Hollywood is one big CIA operation nowadays, even if not even as far back as the invention of the TV itself, probably being a black op invention rolled out in order to propagandize hundreds of millions of people at once. We see the sports industry controlled. And with COVID, we saw hundreds of corporations fall into lockstep with any and all restrictions without regard for the Constitution. And this is a big red flag for me. When we look at these industries, as we previously did here with the 5 major media companies, we found BlackRock and Vanguard holding the largest stakes. We find them holding some interest in the sports industry too. In fact, we find them in control of a majority of the corporations that didn't question the mandates. And as far as the politicians, who is controlling what looks to be about 80% of the world politicians? Is it BlackRock and Vanguard? BlackRock and Vanguard are fairly new with respect to our world being controlled. It seems as though there has been a group of people controlling the strings since well before the inception of either of these two corporations. These top corporations could simply be the financial arm of control of some group or entity operating from behind the scenes. This is to say that the controllers of these companies, like Larry Fink of BlackRock, for instance, he may be a puppet controlled in some way by an unseen entity operating in the shadows. Furthermore, we could then see this occur with our politicians. This entity in the shadows could be using their corporate control to take control of the politicians through donations, kickbacks, laundering, or through the control of blackmail rings like Hugh Hefner and Jeffrey Epstein were. Of course, you could then take that example and overlay it onto the sports stars and sports CEOs, along with the Hollywood stars and the studio CEOs. They could all be being controlled via monetary kickbacks, laundering, job guarantees, or blackmail. We know going back in time that the European elite-controlled American robber barons laid the seeds for the centralization that we are witnessing now, snatching control of the healthcare, the school system, the sciences, etc., and the creation of those world-governing bodies. We also can see that this is their corporate legacy that lives on within the current world business culture today as we know it, with the globalism and the greed and the monopolistic mentality, with whole industries now being centralized. If these men created all of this, or at least helped to lay the seeds of this, how were they able to continue to grow and consolidate power and infiltrate all facets of our life for 100 years after their deaths? The answer is that these men that we were told built America were mere agents, puppets themselves to a greater authority. The obvious control may have come from the bankers, whether Carnegie and his massive steel factories or J.D. Rockefeller and his behemoth oil derricks and refineries all over the country. They needed large sums of capital in order to establish these large operations. This is where J.P. Morgan comes in. He was the European banker agent in the U.S. This is very similar to a concept laid out earlier in this chapter where we spoke about how these early industrialists were able to take over all industry facets and set the tone from the very beginning of this industrial revolution. This is what these people do. Carnegie controlled the industrial product called steel. This invention took the lead in obviously making the railroads, but not just that. Steel would become the leading product in the manufacturing of most of the new construction, buildings, factories, tools, vehicles, etc. Carnegie was the linchpin behind all of this new industry. He supplied it all. With Rockefeller, it's the same thing. Through his control of oil, he could effectively control the whole of transportation in the U.S. Anything shipped, Rockefeller got a cut via having to use oil to power the transportation and distribution of any product, including Carnegie's steel. And not to mention now oil being used to manufacture many products at this time. So we can see how Carnegie could control much of the manufacturing industry, Rockefeller controlling most all of the transportation and distribution, and J.P. Morgan to finance it all. Do you believe that these guys carved all this out themselves? Coordinated, conspired amongst each other while alive, and then also devised a plan to keep this hydra growing and consolidating power and expanding into authoritative world bodies for over 100 years after they're gone? Or is it that this is all just the big creation of the main powers of the time, the banking interests? For it was the banks that were the most developed, wealthy, and powerful industries at this time. Nathan Rothschild had long since established his banking empire all across Europe, centralizing and consolidating it all, and this marked a good opportunity to now begin to take the reins of some of the newest, highly profitable emerging industries like oil or steel, etc. Let me read a quote from author Gary Allen from his book, The Rockefeller File. It says, quote, "The master planners devised the strategy of a merger, a great merger, among nations. But before such a merger can be consummated and the United States becomes just another province in a new world order, there must at least be the semblance of parity among the senior partners in the deal. How does one make the nations of the world more nearly equal? Well, the insiders determined that a two-prong approach was needed. Use American money and know-how to build up your competitors, while at the same time use every devious strategy that you can devise to weaken and impoverish this country. The goal is not to bankrupt the United States, rather it is to reduce our productive might and therefore our standard of living to the meager subsistence level of the socialized nations of the world. The plan is not to bring the standard of living in less developed countries up to our level, but to bring ours down to theirs coming up. It is the standard of living which must be sacrificed on the altar of the New World Order." You might say, well, these men were building America up, not bringing it down, and that is true. However, these industries needed to be built in order to implement this New World Order, and the controllers would never let just anyone be in control of such power and wealth. These new industries had to be created and grown and nurtured and steered towards certain directions, carefully planned every step of the way. Absolute control, ladies and gentlemen. And this is what they're doing today with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. They're creating it. They invented it, and they're going to steer it that way. And it's going to be a fusing of man and digital space and machine. They control it all and always have. Maybe it's just me, but I don't believe that these guys would come up with this on their own. There had to be something or someone behind it all. David Rockefeller, in his memoirs, of which I've spoken about earlier in this book, had some very interesting things to say about whether or not there is some larger globalist conspiracy. He said, quote, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it." So right there, folks, he openly admits that he and others, as he says, we, are part of a, quote, secret cabal, end quote, working, quote, against the best interest of the United States, end quote. Now that we see that they openly admit their plan, the next logical question is why? Well, Mr. Rockefeller tells us that too in his book. He also tells us a little bit about the media's involvement in it all, just in case you don't believe the evidence that this book has already laid out. He says this about these plans, quote, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during these years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries." And there it is, folks. The supernatural sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practices in past centuries, according to David Rockefeller, speaking for us all. They want supernatural sovereignty or unnatural sovereignty. And here's the definition for supernatural: a manifestation or event attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. So take that in for a moment. supernatural, unnatural sovereignty. And clearly he states that this sovereignty will be controlled by an intellectual elite and world bankers. All right in your face, telling you what they're going to do, and they don't think you're going to do anything about it. Chapter 11, the Nazi-Communist Alliance. To finally understand what it is that's going on and who it is that we're fighting against, we have to dissect the current ideologies that are being forced upon the world and then try to figure out who is behind it. We can see that, especially with the Twitter files confirming what we already knew, we can see that fascism showing itself. We didn't need the Twitter files. Many of us saw it also clearly during the COVID lockdowns and mandates. We saw all the large corporations jump right on board all the CDC recommendations without a peep, without any regard for the Constitution, almost as if they wrote them themselves. We could throw in the ESG scoring system that these companies have all opted into and see even more fascism. How about the same exact messaging coming out of their marketing? Like the LGBT agenda push or the anti-white Christian male push being reflected in the commercials and movies for that matter. How about PayPal refusing service to people who commit wrongthink online, which they call hate speech, but is in most cases just an opposing political viewpoint? These are all forms of fascism. When we look close, we can start to make out who the people behind it all are. We see them in the WEF like Schwab. We see them in their political NGOs like Soros. We even see them all throughout Ukraine. Nazis. We even saw them throughout our own government and institutions, scattered all throughout NASA, along with other science and research institutions like DARPA is one example. Operation Paperclip, ladies and gentlemen. This all cannot be denied. A huge misconception with the Nazis is that they adhere to a socialist ideology and system. This is not the case. The Nazis practice a fascist system. In fact, with Hitler taking over and even launching many companies during the 30s and 40s in Germany. In fact, one common description of Nazism is as follows. Nazism is a form of fascism with disdain for liberal democracy and the parliamentary system. It incorporates a dictatorship, fervent anti-Semitism, scientific racism, and the use of eugenics in its creed. You see, I believe that based on my research, we have some sort of an alliance that has been made between the Nazis and the communists. A truce, a treaty, as no single one of these ideologies could gather enough steam to be pushed upon or infiltrated into the U.S. government. It would take all opposing ideologies together if the tyrants ever wanted to take America, and I believe that this was finally realized sometime during World War II, probably near the end. The Nazis have been so vilified in our world since the end of World War II that even the thought of simply forgiving them is thought of as unthinkable. Not many people in America can even openly be sympathetic to them without fearing for their life. This ideology could never be openly accepted. However, when we look at what these people who we have identified as being in charge of the direction of our world, like the WEF or the medicine and science professionals in the U.S., what they're all doing, we see clear as day this ideology being practiced. From the degradation of our liberal democracy, or we could say the controlled demolition of the old liberal world order and our social contract, or through the creating of chimerian viruses, some that were even race-specific in Ukraine and other places around the world in our biolabs, or the obvious soft dictatorships that they've set up around the world under the cover of democracy. We can even see the gleanings of that mad scientist technocracy that Hitler and Mengele had dreamt of when we take a listen to what the WF and Schwab and Harari have to say. But we can see the conditions brewing just perfectly for another ideology that seems to be making inroads, not just in the U.S., but also around the world, one that actually has an official party in the U.S. Communism. Of course, they call it democratic communism, but it makes no difference what they call it or how they rebrand it. It's communism. Communism's shtick is the class struggle, the equality angle. Does the class struggle or equality angle ring any bells inside your heads? Can you think of a time recently that you've heard this spoken about how unfair things are, how rich people are evil? Yes, this communism seed, as we can see, has been planted some time ago, most likely in the 60s at Laurel Canyon. This movement could very well catch steam, especially if the times reflect a very unequal world that one is currently living in. That is to say that by creating a large class divide in a nation on purpose will on paper lead to a larger group of people taking on the communist mindset of class struggle, as we can clearly see and feel the disparity play out in our daily lives right now. As one could deduce, this could be manufactured in a much more accepting way than any Nazi ideology, which, as we've shown, is fascism, and the social justice warriors of today have been taught to hate capitalism and corporations, so fascism would be a complete no-no to them. So a truce was in order if the controllers ever wanted to take America. They would keep their Nazi ideology hidden while promoting democracy. They would encourage voting while knowing the machines have already chosen the winners. And when they get in the office, they will smile at you while they put your grandmother in a nursing home during COVID. The communist angle would be utilized more so socially and culturally, like Mao and his cultural Marxism experiment. You see, as I have written about before and have published films on, his people didn't accept communism in the beginning, but a cultural revolution done just right will beat out any dissent that even the most ardent freedom lover could possibly muster. Always starting with what they call a purge. If you ask anyone on the streets in any Western country and ask them what systems China imposes on its country, they will unequivocally tell you communism. However, this is becoming a very interesting subject. When we speak to some who claim to be experts, like a major economist, you will get a little bit of a different answer to the question. They will say that China practices, especially more recently, a hybrid type of communism. And in fact, because most major economists are controlled by the deep state, who is allied with China, these experts will even go so far as to sugarcoat it and say that it's actually a communist capitalist hybrid. And please don't be fooled by the narrative, folks. It's been tailored just for you for decades. These experts have been reading a script, a pro-China script. In the beginning, in the 80s and 90s, it was a not anti-China script, which has now clearly become a pro-China script. And this script is choreographed in a way to slowly, over the decades, condition the Western populace to believe that China has found a way to mix the best parts of capitalism with the best parts of communism in order to create a really good working system. And the reason, so that this system will be eventually accepted in the United States, especially after a full-on crash and burn of the current system, the current liberal world order system that was directly and indirectly agreed upon at Brentwood and Potsdam after World War II. The problem is that this is still layered in even more deception. I'm going to make a claim. I will agree with many so-called experts and say that China is indeed not fully communistic. In fact, I'll say that communism is not the main system whatsoever. I'll agree with them as to say that China did indeed start off this way, however, but as the experts claim, China has changed its system. And I won't be the first to say this, but it's my scholarly opinion that China should be considered nowadays more of a fascist country. While Mao did seize all production, manufacturing, and farming over time, much of these newly centralized businesses and industries did not stay necessarily 100% in government control. Many of these businesses were put into the hands of prominent party leaders at the time, and many of these businesses became multi-billion-dollar global behemoths. With this amount of money came equal amounts of control and power. And these party leaders eventually became CEOs, answering to the shareholders, except those shareholders are the Communist Party. It's almost as if they're de facto oligarchs. In a 2012 New York Times article, Hu Deping, son of the late Hu Yaobang, the party general secretary, forced to resign in 1987, said that Chinese politics is controlled by the Communist Party and its powerful families and factions. He went on to say that the state is virtually fascist. The article explains that these party leaders over time began to have much more freedom within the management of these businesses and industries as it all grew larger, global, and more complex, putting these business expert party leaders in positions of great power as they are smart and capable enough to start and grow these large, complex businesses. And as Hu explains, This gave way to a fascist situation and fascist mindset to go along with these conditions. Honestly, on their faces, communism isn't much different than fascism at all. Some similarities between fascism and communism is that they both impose totalitarian governments. Now, everyone understands that fascism is nationalistic, like Nazi Germany. And this is correct, but most will claim this isn't the case with communism, and they're wrong. This misconception comes from the revolutionary conquest-minded thought process of the communists. They have always intended, ever since that son of a rabbi from the Trier-Rhine province wrote that book, they've always planned on implementing this system across the globe. And it is this mindset that causes many to say that communism is not nationalistic, but they are missing one thing. The global conquest must begin somewhere, and it begins in the homeland with nationalism. It was done this way at first in Russia. The Bolsheviks used nationalism, or should we say used inequality and disparities within Russia to cause the citizenry to rise up together as one, as a nation, in a very nationalistic way. Once this is done, the attention then turns to the rest of the globe. This was even done during Mao's revolution. Nationalism was used as the rallying cry to get citizens to turn on their traitor brethren, traitors to the country, traitors to the cause. Get it? Quite similar to what is being done in the U.S. right now. Fascism and communism are very, very similar when one takes a good look at them. In fact, the main difference, one that most people will cite, is that fascism morphs government and industry together as one. The description for communism states that all means of production and manufacturing get centralized by the government. Now reread those. Is there any real difference? Take Twitter, for example. They're a private business. However, in secret, the FBI, DHS, and DNI were all having weekly meetings with Twitter execs, telling them who and what to censor from their platform. Now, I don't know how long this went on for, but let's just say a couple years. The government determining who should be censored from the digital public square and what information is allowed to be heard or not. Is this fascism or is it communism? I suppose one would have to say fascism, as Twitter is still subject to public checks and balances via shareholders, etc., but it's still the government calling the shots. So could we be correct in saying that this is communistic? The censorship is definitely quite communistic. I guess what I'm saying here is that it seems to me that the differences between these two ideologies is like trying to split hairs. With such minuscule overall differences, it becomes clear to see how these two ideologies could ally together in order to turn off the last remaining light still lit in this corrupt world. It seems more and more clear by the day that this Nazi form of government with the authoritarian style and the mad scientist biolabs spread all throughout the world conducting experiments on whole populations in accordance with the Nazi-assisted founding of the operation known as MK-Ultra, Mind Control Ultra, with the K being the German K instead of the C for control, it's the K. But that capitalistic economic system must too be destroyed, and what they have planned up their sleeves is going to do just that. See, this great reset is choreographed, pre-planned decades ago. We were to see war, famine, and energy crisis, all of which we can all see either already playing out or moving fast in our rear view heading straight towards us. When this perfect storm hits and the world burns, these Nazis are coming. Go look at the Denver airport. They will be presenting to us a better way, a new way. They will offer refuge from this current system, which has just crashed and burned. They will offer you reconciliation for your bills and all of the debt that many of us will never get out from under. Some of it will be forgiven, so as long as you take the chip and enter into the new digital space to be ran by your Nazi technocrats, techno-gods. How can anyone turn it down after witnessing the spectacular crash and burn of the current system? The current system that is hated by the brainwashed youth of the day. The current system which is so unequal and unfair that those big bad billionaire and millionaire oppressing us all, as most of the millennials believe. And besides, they think this new system is awesome. Just look at the last remaining world power and world superpower after the crash is over in China. The sheep will think their system works so well through all of this. They're going to say that I guess the mainstream media was right about that modern system of hybrid communism being so great. And now, folks, we can see how these two ideologies are being used to transform the United States. We would need a piece of evidence that links these two ways of thinking and that shows a concerted effort of it being implemented upon us, but this may be like trying to find a jackalope. All we can do is read some of their papers and decipher their actions as we see it all play out. It is my belief, through reading many of their supposed sci-fi books or even their supposed factual white papers or their UN agenda reports like Agenda 2030, that we are facing a Nazi world government takeover facilitated in part by our very own government, beginning with Operation Paperclip. I'm able to deduce this by watching their actions. The Nazis were fascist technocrats who put science and the manipulation thereof as its top authority. Even the basic tenets of Nazism is based off of Nazi pseudoscience, like the goal of trying to create a Superman, a pure-blooded superhuman being, as the Nazis openly admitted. Not to even mention the work by Joseph Mengele and all of the experiments performed on innocent people across the world. We can see that this great reset, as stated by those in the WEF, is going to be this high-tech fusing of man and digital machine. This is most likely straight out of Joe Mengele's personal diary, no doubt. The Nazis were also expert manipulators, and Joe Goebbels understood manipulation very well. He had known by 1940 that when one tells a lie over and over and over again, that to many it will become a truth. And we are seeing that tactic being played in America right in front of our faces for years now. Then finally, when we look at the state of our industries, when we look at Twitter, or when we look at everything that happened during COVID, or when we look at all of the merchandising, messaging, all clearly centralized, we can no doubt see fascism playing out right in front of our eyes, clear as day. These are all Nazi-specific tactics and mindsets. The problem is that Nazis have been used via the controllers, most of whom claim to be Zionists, to be the excuse to not be able to criticize those in control. And Hitler has been used to demonize anyone that the establishment doesn't like. They nurtured this narrative for 80 years in order to get folks to not accept certain political candidates, etc. Just look at how they call what they call all conservatives. They call us Nazis, even as we speak. So obviously this form of government must be implemented quietly and through infiltration. In fact, in an odd way, the demonization of the Nazis and fascism has provided cover for government and private industry to partner up, as no corporation in America would ever want fascism. And likewise, our benevolent government leaders would never allow it, as it is against the Constitution. It's too in your face, too obvious. In fact, so obvious that when a critical thinker looks at it all, they will immediately discount it as it's too unbelievable. They obviously aren't acting in a fascist way, as that would be too stupid and everyone would see it. So obviously that isn't what's happening, and so I shouldn't believe my lying eyes. Yes, dear listeners, it's a sick group of people in charge of things. Fascism isn't an option in America. However, many today feel that something is necessary as capitalism is flawed and has run its course. And folks, they might be right. However, what many fail to realize is that the capitalist system still works. It's just that the powers that be have deliberately reduced many checks and balances, infiltrated institutions and corrupted them, and have changed laws that have worked to destroy the system that had seemed to work so well when implemented properly. But still, many are calling for the change. What with all of the economic disparity found everywhere throughout the world, and after what's coming, the crash and burn and famine, it will all be 10 times worse. And so the calls for change will grow louder and louder until finally the controllers will unveil their plan that they've had up their sleeves for decades to present to the confused, stressed, starving masses who will be begging for something. I believe that this is where the communist side comes in of this new ideology. The case will be made, and has already been made, that China practices a hybrid form of communism, a capitalist communist hybrid. It will be sold to the world as the best of capitalism. Capitalism without the inequality. And the communist part, well, that will be the best of communism. You know, the good parts about it. And they'll have all of their shills go on TV and explain how wonderful it all will be. The world will be in such agony that they will accept whatever's thrown to them. They will implement what they will sell as some sort of a partnership between private companies and the central government. This is fascism, folks, and it's already being practiced here in the U.S. Please see the Twitter files. The government is telling companies how to run their business, who to censor, and what topics we are allowed to talk about. Nothing will change. It will just be considered official policy now, and with the sheep supposedly being informed that it is occurring as opposed to them doing it now just in the shadows. So it will be what they will sell as a communist-style economy, as the pill is easier to swallow than fascism. And as the world has been softened up for this communism over the last few decades, it will be easily accepted. But in reality, will be fascist, and it will continue to operate as it has been for years now, in my opinion.